The morning after Richard's funeral should have been filled with grief and remembrance, but instead it was laced with calculation and betrayal. And before I take you through the entire story, let me ask you something. Have you ever been pushed aside by your own family, treated not as a person but as an obstacle to be moved, as if your years of sacrifice meant nothing? Comment where you are watching from and tell me if you have ever felt underestimated, because my story begins with that very sting. A sting that turned into the quiet fire of revenge. My name is Elellanar Grace Whitmore. I am 68 years old, and for nearly 5 decades I was a wife, a mother, and the steady heart of Hazelbrook Orchards, a small organic apple farm nestled in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. My hands, stiff now with arthritis, still remember every careful step of kneading sourdough dough at dawn, pruning trees under summer suns and winter snows, delivering crates to food banks, and holding up a family that seemed worth every ounce of my strength. Richard, my husband, stood beside me through all of it, and together we built a home, a business, and a legacy. We married in 1981, when the orchard was just an idea and a piece of rough land with more stones than soil, but through sweat and belief we turned it into a place people came to love, a place children chased fireflies and neighbors gathered for pies, a place where love was baked into every loaf of bread. 3 weeks ago, I buried him after 14 months of watching pancreatic cancer hollow out the man who once lifted bushels of apples as if they weighed nothing. He did not want the children to know the full weight of his illness, whispering through morphine fog that they should be allowed to live free of shadows for a little while longer, and I honored that wish even though in my heart I already knew Darren and Samantha had been drifting far away long before diagnosis ever entered our lives. Darren, the eldest, carved out a fast-paced career in Boston's financial world, and his visits dwindled to a handful of weekends across more than a decade, each one shorter, more distracted, filled with phone calls and impatient glances at his watch. Samantha floated from one failed wellness business to another, each venture funded by Richard's quiet generosity, each collapse cushioned by savings he pulled from the orchard we sweated over. I believed, or perhaps desperately hoped, that grief would bring them back to the roots that shaped us, that burying their father would remind them of childhood dinners under our old oak table, of nights they fell asleep to the sound of cicadas while Richard and I worked late among the trees. But when they returned for the funeral, I did not see children mourning their father. I saw professionals calculating an estate, eyes already moving past loss toward numbers. The night after we laid Richard to rest, I sat at our worn wooden dining table, tracing the grooves he had carved there years ago, and suggested gently that we go through his things together the next day, a small act of shared remembrance, a chance to breathe memory back into the house. They agreed with polite nods, but their eyes spoke of other priorities, and by morning when sunlight spilled through the lace curtains Richard and I had chosen together 3 decades earlier, I found them descending the stairs dressed sharply as though headed for a business meeting, Darren in a blazer, Samantha in silk and perfectly curled hair, the image of strangers who had once been my babies. I brewed simple coffee, the kind Richard loved, while Darren set down his imported Boston blend like a corporate trophy, and then came the words that would pierce deeper than any winter frost. Mom, we've been talking, it's time to settle things. The estate, the business, the house. The orchard, they said, was too much for me, the house too large for someone my age. My age? As if years of pruning trees through blizzards, handling payroll when we couldn't afford an assistant, baking pies to fundraise for the community, driving tractors and hauling crates meant nothing now. Samantha's voice slid smooth as a sales pitch, telling me about a retirement community called Sunnyvale Estates, 2 hours south, where I could have activities and friends my age, and Darren followed by producing a folder, corporate letterhead gleaming, with a signature that looked too steady, too clean, far too unlike the hand of a man dosed with morphine. Richard's will, they claimed, signed last year, leaving the business in Darren's hands. I stared at the papers, at the false steadiness of ink that screamed forgery, and told them this was not from our family lawyer. They pushed, insisted he had been lucid, that he wanted a fresh start, that a developer had already shown interest, $7 million for the land, money enough to set us all up to take care of me. But what they were really proposing was to erase a lifetime of harvest, to bulldoze roots and dreams for concrete cul-de-sacs. And I felt the first flicker of a slow-burning fury stir inside me, the same instinct that once drove me to chase a fox away from our chicken coop with nothing but a broom in my hands. Quietly I asked to see the real will, and when Darren pressed the papers toward me again, I refused to touch them, told them I was going to bed, that we would talk tomorrow. But deep down, beneath the ache of widowhood, I knew there would be no tomorrow conversation, because my children had not come home. By morning the smell of coffee filled the farmhouse again, but it was not the warm familiar scent Richard loved. It was the sharp bitter imported roast Darren always bragged about, and as I made my way down the stairs with joints aching more from betrayal than age, I found my children already in coats with a suitcase by the door, not mine but one they had packed for me. Samantha's voice too bright as she explained they thought we could take a little drive today just to look at Sunnyvale, the retirement community where I would apparently spend the rest of my life, and Darren checking his watch as if I were already a meeting running late. I poured myself a cup of their coffee and told them calmly I had lived in this home my entire adult life and it was not theirs to take. But Darren's face hardened, Samantha pressed her smile like a mask, and soon I was ushered toward the car with the pretense of choice stripped away. We drove past the orchard just beginning to bloom, past the elementary school where I had once volunteered and the library where I read to children, and I let them believe I was defeated, that I had accepted the end of Hazelbrook, even as my purse weighed heavy with more than just medication. 20 minutes later Darren veered off the main road, dust rising behind the tires, and pulled onto a gravel shoulder by an empty field. His voice casual when he said, "This is where you get off, Mom, the house and business are ours now." Samantha faltered, whispering his name as if even she was startled by his cruelty, but he opened my door and gestured toward the horizon, adding that there was a gas station 5 miles up and that I had clothes and medicine enough. Just like that they drove away, their car shrinking into the distance, leaving me with a suitcase of their choosing, the wind tugging at my coat, and the taste of betrayal sharper than any bitterness in that coffee. Yet I did not crumble. I did not cry. I stood still on that gravel road and realized something remarkable. I was free, and in my purse rested the key they had forgotten existed, the original deed to 20 acres of land purchased in my maiden name decades earlier, land that held the only natural water source on the entire property, land no developer could touch without my signature. With each step toward town my purpose solidified, blistering feet and aching knees carrying me not to the gas station but to Miller's Gas and Grocery at the edge of Hazelbrook, where I sat on a weathered bench and gathered my thoughts. Ray Miller, who had known me for 30 years, came out wiping his hands on his apron and asked gently if I was all right, offering me the use of his phone when he saw the suitcase and the pale look on my face. In that small back office surrounded by shelves of canned peaches and discount cereal, I dialed the number of our family lawyer from memory, and Harold Jennings answered on the first ring, surprised I had missed the will reading, informing me Darren had already presented a document that did not match the one my husband had updated last year. My grip tightened on the receiver as I told him I needed his help and his discretion, and he assured me I had both, instructing me to come to his office within the hour. I purchased a prepaid phone and a bottle of water from Ray, who refused to take my money, his kindness nearly undoing me, but I held myself steady because I had work to do and grief could not be my master anymore. Harold's office was in a Victorian house across from the library, the same building where Richard had signed contracts years before, and as I sat across from him in a worn leather chair, I told everything: the forged will, the boardroom tone in my kitchen, the roadside abandonment, every detail of my children's betrayal. He listened without interruption, his expression darkening as I spoke, and when I finished I pulled from my purse the fireproof box and placed into his hands the deed to the land with water rights, my lifeline and leverage. Harold studied the document with reverence before saying words that struck like thunder. "This isn't just land, this is gold. The developer can't touch anything without it." He confirmed what I already knew, that Darren's presented will was a forgery, too clean for a man under hospice care, and promised to challenge it in court while immediately filing an injunction to freeze any sale of Hazelbrook orchards. By noon the next day, the developer received notice that the deal was suspended, their lawyers already reaching out in panic, as they discovered the land was incomplete, and the water rights were untouchable. That evening a message arrived on my prepaid phone, the first contact from Samantha since she watched me left by the roadside. Reading simply, "Mom, please call me, Darren's freaking out, we didn't know about that other land, can we just fix this?" But there was no apology, no recognition of the cruelty they had inflicted, only panic that their golden deal was slipping through their fingers, and I did not reply. Later Darren called Harold directly, demanding explanations, but Harold answered with the calm of a man backed by truth, informing him all matters would now go through legal channels. They were realizing they had miscalculated badly, that the woman they abandoned was not broken but armed with truth, land, and law, and as I sat in Harold's office reviewing the documents, I said quietly what had become my creed. They thought I had nothing left, but I had everything they forgot to value. Harold looked at me with quiet pride and told me I was handling it with grace when many would have chosen scorched earth. But I knew this was not about revenge for its own sake. It was about truth and peace, about reclaiming what had always been mine. And in that moment I understood that betrayal had not ended my story, it had sharpened it. And I was ready for the fight. The days that followed moved with a strange mixture of speed and silence, as if the town carried on with its usual rhythm while beneath the surface a storm brewed. And I found myself no longer grieving quietly in the shadows but standing at the edge of a battle for everything Richard and I had built, a battle I had never expected to fight against my own blood. Harold worked swiftly, drafting letters and filing motions, his steady hands shuffling documents that could determine the fate of Hazelbrook, and by the second day the developer's lawyers had reached out again, their tone no longer confident but nervous, asking for clarification on the land rights, asking why the signature Darren had presented looked so suspiciously perfect, asking questions they had not asked before they shook hands on a $7 million deal. Harold responded firmly that the water rights were held in my name alone, that the deed had been preserved for decades, that no sale could move forward without my explicit consent, and in that moment the power shifted, no longer resting with Darren and Samantha but with me, the woman they thought too old and fragile to stand in their way. The orchard itself seemed to breathe easier, its rows of trees budding with spring blossoms, the air sweet with the promise of renewal, while my children's panic began to seep through in desperate messages and late-night calls to Harold, their tone a blend of anger and fear, their perfect plan unraveling thread by thread. Samantha wrote again, this time pleading for a meeting, insisting she hadn't known Darren would go so far, that she only wanted what was best for me. But her words rang hollow when I remembered her polished smile as she handed me the suitcase and urged me into the car. Darren, ever the strategist, tried intimidation, reminding Harold of his connections in Boston, threatening to drag things out in court, but Harold remained unmoved, his calm replies delivered with the weight of law and experience, and every time Darren tried to tighten his grip, it slipped further from his hands. I stayed in my modest apartment above the bakery, the scent of cinnamon and bread greeting me each morning as I watched the town move in its honest, unhurried way. And I found solace in knowing I was not alone, that people like Ray Miller and the neighbors who had once gathered in our orchard for autumn festivals whispered words of support when they saw me on Main Street, their eyes full of quiet solidarity. Meanwhile, Harold prepared for the inevitable confrontation, gathering not just the deed but affidavits from doctors who could testify to Richard's condition during his final months, handwriting experts ready to analyze the forged will, and local officials who knew the zoning laws that made the water rights critical to any development. He told me we were building not just a defense but a wall of truth that no amount of corporate polish could scale, and for the first time in weeks I slept soundly, knowing that the silence of betrayal had been replaced with the steady hum of justice forming. Then came the escalation, an official notice that Darren and Samantha had tried to move forward with the sale anyway, pressuring the developer to overlook the missing piece of land, and Harold responded immediately with a cease and desist backed by the injunction already filed in court. Word spread quickly in a small town, and soon people spoke in hushed tones about the Whitmore children trying to sell off their father's legacy, about the forged signature, about the mother abandoned by the roadside. The shame they had tried to bury me under was now theirs to carry, and while part of me mourned the loss of the children I thought I had raised, another part felt a fierce clarity, the kind Richard would have called backbone, the kind that comes when love has been trampled one too many times. One evening as the sun set over the hills, casting golden light across the orchard I could still see from town, Harold handed me a copy of the judge's order freezing all transactions until the matter was resolved, and I held that paper like a shield, not against strangers but against my own blood. This was no longer about whether I was too old to run the orchard or whether I could find comfort in a retirement home. It was about truth, about the soil beneath my feet and the legacy of decades of labor, about refusing to be erased. Darren and Samantha might have believed they had cornered me, but now they were the ones trapped, and the walls closing in on them were made not of spite but of evidence, law, and the one thing they had under. The confrontation came sooner than I expected, not in some grand courtroom with cameras flashing but in a simple conference room above the county clerk's office, its beige walls and humming fluorescent lights making it feel more like a school meeting than the battlefield it truly was. And yet as I walked in with Harold at my side, clutching the leather folder that contained the original deed, the forged will, and statements from doctors who had treated Richard in his final months, I felt the weight of decades pressing down and the strange calm that comes when you know the truth is finally about to speak. Darren sat at the far end of the table, his blazer crisp, his tie knotted with corporate precision, though his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights he had endured since the injunction froze his plans, and beside him Samantha shifted uncomfortably, her silk blouse immaculate but her hands twisting in her lap, the perfect curls in her hair unable to hide the cracks forming in her confidence. Across from them sat two representatives of the development firm, their briefcases stacked neatly, their faces drawn into lines of caution rather than confidence now that they understood the deal they had been promised was incomplete. Harold opened the meeting with the steady authority of a man who had spent 30 years practicing law in this county, laying out each document one by one, starting with the updated will Richard had signed the year before, his signature shaky but real, witnessed and notarized, clearly contradicting the clean, bold forgery Darren had pushed forward. He moved next to the affidavits from Richard's hospice nurse and attending physician, both confirming that in the weeks Darren claimed his father had signed documents, Richard could barely hold a pen, let alone produce a flawless corporate signature, and as the evidence stacked higher, the silence around the table grew heavier. Finally Harold slid forward the deed, its paper aged but perfectly preserved, the name Elellanar Grace Whitmore printed clearly, its description outlining the 20 acres of land that held the only natural water source feeding Hazelbrook orchards, land I had purchased in my maiden name before marriage, land that Richard and I had set aside as our just-in-case safety net, land no one could touch without me. The developer's representatives leaned in, their eyes scanning the document, and one finally exhaled sharply, closing his briefcase with a snap, murmuring that their firm could not proceed under these conditions, that they had been misled about the completeness of the estate, that no reputable company would risk litigation of this scale. Darren's face flushed red, his practiced composure cracking as he accused Harold of manipulation, his voice rising as he insisted Richard had promised him control, that as the eldest son it was his right, and Samantha tried to calm him, her voice pleading now, turning toward me for the first time, calling me mom as if the word alone could erase what she had done. I sat quietly through it all, my hands folded on the table, letting Harold handle the storm, and when Darren finally ran out of steam, when his threats turned to hollow echoes in that small beige room, I lifted my head and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even me. This orchard was not built on greed, I said softly but clearly. It was built on love, on work, on every blister and every harvest your father and I gave to this soil. You wanted to sell it for numbers on a page. But land remembers who tends it, and so do people. You have not just betrayed me. You have betrayed everything your father stood for. The room was silent, Samantha's eyes filling with tears, Darren's jaw tight as stone, the developers already gathering their papers, eager to escape a deal turned toxic. Harold ended the meeting by stating plainly that the matter would continue in court, that the forged will would be challenged formally, that criminal charges could be considered, and that any attempt to move forward with a sale would be met with swift legal action. As we left, I felt no triumphal surge, only a deep exhale, the kind that comes when the weight you've carried begins to lift, and yet beneath it all was the sharp knowledge that while the orchard was safe for now, the true wound was not in paperwork or property but in the faces of the children I once held in my arms, children who had chosen betrayal over blood. Still, I had drawn the line. I had stood in the room and spoken my truth, and in that moment in the weeks that followed that tense meeting, the dust of legal motions and frozen contracts began to settle into something more permanent, and I realized that my next step could not simply be about protecting myself. It had to be about protecting Hazelbrook from ever falling into greedy hands again. So while Darren scrambled to salvage his reputation and Samantha sent half-hearted messages that sounded more like panic than remorse, I sat on the small balcony of my apartment above the bakery, with the deed spread out across my lap, and thought about what legacy really meant, not in the language of lawyers but in the rhythm of seasons, the patience of soil, the memory of trees. Richard and I had always talked about ensuring that the orchard would outlive us in the right way, not as a commodity to be bulldozed but as a living thing that would continue feeding the town. And with that memory alive in my chest, I walked into the office of the Hazelbrook Agricultural Cooperative, a small but determined group of young farmers, teachers, and community leaders who had been struggling to expand their sustainable programs, and I placed the deed on their table, telling them I was ready to donate the water rights into a trust that could never be sold. Their eyes widened, some with shock and some with gratitude, and one young woman whispered that with those rights secured they could guarantee irrigation for generations, that they could train high school students in organic farming, that Hazelbrook could remain a place of growth rather than concrete. In that moment I felt Richard beside me, smiling the way he used to when seedlings finally broke through the soil, and I knew I had made the choice he would have wanted. News spread quickly, as it always does in small towns, and within days it reached Darren and Samantha, who realized with horror that not only had their forged will been frozen in court, but the key piece of land that made the orchard valuable to developers had been permanently removed from any possibility of sale. Their messages changed tone again, shifting from anger to desperate bargaining, promises of reconciliation if only I would reconsider. But it was too late. The twist they had never imagined had unfolded, their plan undone not by shouting or vengeance, but by a quiet stroke of a pen that placed the future of Hazelbrook beyond their reach forever. The developer officially withdrew, citing incomplete land rights and the risk of litigation, their representatives no longer returning Darren's calls, and the whispers in town grew louder, people shaking their heads at how greed had blinded two children to the values their father had lived by. I did not gloat, I did not need to, because the orchard itself was proof enough of my victory, its blossoms unfolding as if to remind me that resilience is written in petals and branches just as much as in legal documents. Harold called me one evening to say that the judge had formally recognized the injunction and scheduled a hearing on the forgery, his voice steady with satisfaction, and he told me I had not just won a legal battle, I had ensured that Hazelbrook's heart would continue beating in the right rhythm. Sitting alone on my balcony with the scent of bread drifting up from the bakery below, I thought about how strange it was that betrayal had brought me here, how my children's attempt to erase me had instead led me to carve my name more deeply into the land than ever before. They had wanted to sell off Richard's life's work for $7 million, but I had given away something more priceless, the guarantee that the orchard would endure as it was meant to. And in that quiet twist of fate I found a peace no sum of money could ever buy, the peace of knowing I had not only protected my past but secured the future. And no matter what, life after the twist settled into a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and deeply comforting, because for the first time in years I was living not under the weight of expectation or betrayal but under the quiet dignity of my own choices. And though I no longer slept in the farmhouse Richard and I had built, I found solace in the modest apartment above the bakery, where each morning the scent of cinnamon rolls and warm bread drifted upward like a reminder that even in lost life continues to rise. I furnished the space simply with a rocking chair on the balcony and a few potted herbs that I tended with the same care I once gave to acres of trees, and though my hands still ached with arthritis, they also remembered the muscle memory of nurturing, of coaxing life into soil. The town began to see me not as the abandoned widow cast aside by her children but as a figure of resilience, and invitations flowed in from the community center where I resumed teaching quilting on Wednesday nights, from the library where I led workshops on sustainable gardening, and even from the high school where a teacher asked if I would speak to her students about the history of Hazelbrook orchards. Each gathering reminded me that while Darren and Samantha had chosen to betray me, the broader family of community had chosen to lift me up, and when teenagers leaned forward eagerly as I explained crop rotation or retirees smiled while threading needles at quilting class, I felt more connected than I had in years. Meanwhile, the consequences for my children unfolded quietly but unmistakably. Word of the forged will and the failed sale spread beyond Hazelbrook, reaching Boston where Darren's colleagues whispered about the scandal and questioned his integrity, and trickling through the wellness circles Samantha had once inhabited, casting doubt on her ventures and making investors wary. They retreated into silence, no longer storming with demands but nursing reputational wounds of their own making. And while part of me grieved the distance, another part accepted it as the natural consequence of choices made. I did not pursue criminal charges though Harold assured me I could, because revenge was never my aim, and yet the orchard itself served as the most eloquent verdict. Its trees blooming, its soil untouched, its water rights locked safely in trust with the cooperative, ensuring that Darren and Samantha's betrayal ended not in destruction but in renewal. Often I walked the dirt road along the orchard's edge, the blossoms perfuming the air, and though I no longer lived inside the farmhouse I would pause at the fence line and smile, feeling Richard's presence in every branch that swayed with the breeze. Townsfolk would nod as they passed, some stopping to thank me for protecting the land, others simply acknowledging with a look that they understood what it meant to fight quietly but firmly. I did not need the world to know my story. It was enough that Hazelbrook knew, that Richard's legacy remained intact, that I had found a new life rooted not in bitterness but in peace. In the evenings I would sit on my balcony, prepaid phone tucked away, sipping tea as the sun sank behind the hills, and I would think about how strange it was that the worst betrayal of my life had led me here. Not broken but whole, not erased but more visible than ever. My children had tried to reduce me to a footnote, to write me out of the story, but instead I had reclaimed the narrative, and in doing so I had discovered a strength that had always been mine, quiet but unshakable. I often thought back to that gravel road where Darren opened my door and told me, "This is where you get off, Mom," as if decades of sacrifice could be dismissed with a wave of his hand, and a suitcase I never packed, and I realized that moment should have broken me, but instead it became the turning point where silence hardened into strength and betrayal clarified into truth, because standing alone with nothing but the clothes they had chosen for me, I discovered I had everything that mattered: my identity, my history, my land, and my resolve. For years I had believed that being a mother meant tolerating, forgiving endlessly, bending until I was nearly unrecognizable. But when my own children looked at me as an obstacle rather than a parent, I finally understood that love without respect is not love at all, and that loyalty without question is not virtue but chains. The orchard still stands because I stood, because I remembered that before I was a wife, before I was a mother, before I was a widow, I was Elellanar Grace Whitmore, a woman who built something from bare soil with her hands, her heart, and her will. My children saw weakness in my quiet nature. They mistook trust for naivety, but they forgot that power is not always loud. Sometimes it is steady, rooted, patient, and it waits for the right season to bloom. When I donated the water rights to the cooperative, I sealed not only the orchard's future but my own transformation. I stopped living in the shadow of being erased and began living in the light of being whole. And every time I walk past the blossoms that perfume Hazelbrook spring, I know that I did not just save trees. I saved the truth of who I am. So to anyone listening who has been cast aside, underestimated, or told this is where you get off, I want you to hear me clearly. You are more than the roles they try to confine you in. Your strength is not measured by how loudly you fight but by how firmly you stand, and even when betrayal comes from the people you raised, it does not define you, your response does. I did not scream, I did not beg, I did not crumble. I walked with purpose, I stood with quiet power, and in the end my voice echoed louder than their betrayal. My orchard still blooms, my name is still on the deed, my life is mine again, and my story is not one of defeat but of reclamation. If this story touched something in you, if you too have ever been underestimated and found your strength, share it in the comments below, because your story matters, your voice matters, and like mine it might just save someone else. And so here I stand, not on the gravel road where they left me and not in the farmhouse Richard and I once built, but in the quiet certainty that I was never truly abandoned because I carried with me the deed to my own worth all along. A worth they could not erase with signatures forged or papers waved across a breakfast table. The orchard breathes on, blossoms opening as if nothing had changed, yet everything has, because I have learned that the truest revenge is not anger or destruction, but the calm reclamation of what is yours, the refusal to let betrayal write the final chapter of your life. My children thought they could strip me of home, of legacy, of dignity, but instead they uncovered the steel beneath my silence and reminded me that I am not defined by their choices but by my own. If you have ever been told you are too old, too weak, too irrelevant to matter, remember this. Your story is not over unless you decide it is, and the strength you think is gone is often only waiting for the moment you finally need it. I chose peace, I chose truth, I chose to stand, and in doing so I found freedom that no retirement community and no check for $7 million could ever buy. My orchard still stands, my name still carries, my heart still beats steady, and so does yours. If this story moved you, share it, leave a comment below, let us know where you are watching from, and